Business Now is brought to you by the Information Technology Association of America, business development, networking, and public policy leadership for today's IT industry, and Avaya, delivering intelligent communications for business transformation, customer service, productivity, and collaboration, and in part by Sprint, together with Nextel. Stay connected, stay informed. And in cooperation with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, and Maryland Public Television.
Identity management are people who they say they are. In the years since the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, that has become a critical question when people apply for a driver's license, when they cross U.S. borders, or even when they board a commercial airplane, to name just a few examples. The Department of Homeland Security, in conjunction with other federal, state, and local agencies, is operating a number of programs designed to answer that question. But 6 years and millions of dollars later, are we any safer? Will all of these programs work together? Or will Americans, hoping for stronger security, have to settle for more ID cards? Are citizens and taxpayers realizing all of the benefits that cutting-edge technology has to offer? Joining us today on Tech Talk are Kathy Kraninger, Director of the Office of Screening Coordination at the Department of Homeland Security; Gordon Hanna, Managing Director for Bearing Point's Public Sector Security and Identity Management Group; and Chris Dorabek, Editor-in-Chief of Federal Computer Week magazine. Welcome to all of you, and let me just turn maybe Kathy to you first. A number of programs, as we mentioned in the introduction, which from your perspective, an important one at DHS, what are some of the most important programs in terms of ID management that our audience ought to be aware of?
Well, Phil, there are a number of identity management initiatives going on within the government today, and primarily I think that we have to focus on the purpose behind them, and it is a risk management perspective that we're taking with these programs. And so we have to look at the environment where we are concerned about who people are and whether they're who they say they are, and how we apply that. I think the best example you noted is crossing the border. And as individuals enter the United States today by air, they are required to present a passport. That it was put into effect as part of the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative in January of this year. At our land and sea borders today, we do not have a document requirement, and we are moving expeditiously towards alternative documents to a passport, recognizing the cultural change that is taking place at our land borders as we require people to have identification.
Well, let me jump in to ask about risk management a little bit. Obviously managing the risk to the country, but I think what you're saying too is that a system, there may be a hypothetical system that would get 100% coverage in identifying that everybody is who they say they are, but that might be too costly, too slow, too whatever. So you have to balance some of those concerns.
Absolutely. I would say it is a balance, not just for the security perspective, but also from the privacy side. There are a lot of people that are concerned about the federal government having a database on U.S. citizens or on everyone entering the United States, how that is used, how that information is applied. And so it is a layered approach, different accesses, different areas that people have or to access to, that requires more screening than domestic travel, for example. So when you're talking about people who work in a port, in a seaport, through our Transportation Worker Identification Credential Program or the TWIC program, or you're talking about people who work in the nuclear sector or the chemical sector. Those are areas where we have noted there's a higher threat, vulnerability, consequence to an incident that would take place in those areas, and so there is a higher threshold of screening that is conducted on those individuals. But then it goes, to a lesser degree, depending on what people have access to. Those are entering the country, we're very concerned about their identities and ensuring that we know who they are. And when you get to domestic travel, there is also an identity component to that, but it is something that we've been phasing in over time. There is a document requirement, obviously, but it is not as stringent as a passport, for example, to travel domestically.
I think that's one of the big issues that you face a lot is, yes, it's possible to screen out everybody, but how long are people going to wait in line? You need to have commerce. You need to be able to move around the country. How many, can we even afford it? The government has spent a lot of money on this U.S. visit program, which seeks to not only track when people come into the country, but also when they leave. The coming in was relatively easy because a lot of this systems and processes were at least partially in place, so they've been able to do that. It's a getting out. How do you measure when people leave? That's much more difficult. And so what we're finding is that there's also an interconnectedness of all these systems, and everyone says, well, this is technology, you just plug and play. It's not quite that easy, and I think that's part of the issues that you're seeing. And Kathy mentioned the privacy issues. Right now, when you fly, there's already less privacy when you fly now than there was pre-September 11th. I think people are willing to give up a certain amount of that for safety. How far does that go? If you had to carry your passport with you, if any time we, God forbid, mention the national ID card, people just freak out. This country has sort of a history of wanting to maintain our private information and maintain that as our information, and that the government doesn't get it all. So there are a lot of issues.
And they seem to be, I think it's fair to say, tell me if I'm wrong, that people are willing to make those trades if they see a real value. So if there's a real cost benefit there to be had, lines at the airport.
Trying to guess how people make those kinds of assessments is, DHS has been trying to deal with that, and sometimes you go a little far and people freak out and you go, okay, let's reassess. I think DHS has done a really good job. DHS has the only, I think, legislated privacy officer, chief privacy officer, is a person who watches out just for privacy. And I think they've done a pretty good job of incorporating privacy issues early on in the process. Often what happens in government systems is it's sort of like an add-on. Okay, we've created this system, now people are squawking about privacy, let's figure out how we can retrofit the system to make privacy important. DHS has done a pretty good job of saying, okay, privacy needs to be something we consider from the beginning. And I think it's a pretty important step, and maybe a model for other agencies.
Multi-layered and privacy on top of that, this is a complex situation.
It is. These are very complex systems to implement and operate. The policy and process that complements the technology can be very complex. There are very complex business rules. And I was going to add, one of the things we found in implementing these very advanced, I call them old ID cards on steroids types of identity documents, is that it can actually increase the individual's sense of privacy by letting them contain or hold on to the information. And it can also automate the transactions. The pilots around...
But back up a little bit, because I think it's important for our viewers from the Baltimore to Washington area, many who work for the federal government, where there are going to be new ID cards and requirements, to understand that point you were just making, that it actually can give them control and maybe a sense of greater privacy.
It does. It lets them control when the documents are essentially presented and read and authenticated, and the confidence that the data is not retained in the systems that are checking them. They're just validating strongly the identity as it's presented. It actually might go beyond the fact of an old log that you sign into and your information's recorded there in perpetuity. Now you contain and control the transaction.
Interesting. Although not, I think, what people's first reaction is when they're asked for a biometric.
It is.
Not maybe the first thing that comes to mind. Talk to us a little bit, Kathy, about the use of biometrics in some of these different programs.
Well, again, it goes back to those layers of security and what the purpose of the particular identity management program is. If it's access control, it is generally very beneficial, and it helps with facilitating, as Chris was talking about, to use some of this technology. For example, we've used Iris on some of our trusted traveler programs as a quicker way to identify the individual uniquely and allow them to pass through the checkpoint or the port of entry more quickly.
Any initial resistance from folks?
Those are voluntary programs, and they provide a benefit to the individuals, and they have the ability to decide whether or not they want to participate.
Going to your point about empowerment, right?
So that is
I
a
think that's
huge
an
part of
important
it.
role is allowing people to you can choose whether you give up this information or not. And I think that's a powerful player in how people, if there's a benefit, the registered traveler program, which allows you to sort of get through the lines a lot more speedily.
Benefit is clear.
Your benefit's very clear. However, that program hasn't been particularly successful. I don't think that's the only reason. But I think it's one of the reasons that people are just, hold on, I wait 5 minutes or I wait 2 minutes. Is that 3 minutes really that important to me? It's these kinds of assessments that go into that issue all the time.
We're going to see more biometrics, though, presumably?
Definitely. I think, again, as it becomes more acceptable to people, as people understand how it's being used and where and why, that it will become more prolific. The fingerprint in particular has been a touchy biometric. It's certainly one of the most useful from our perspective because you don't leave your iris at the scene of a crime.
Right.
So in terms of being able to match against criminal information, particularly in employment situations like federal employees or transportation workers, those have been mandated by law. So we do collect fingerprints in those situations.
There are interesting debates that go on over this stuff. I mean, I know DHS was struggling. Do you collect 1 fingerprint, 3 fingerprints, 6, 8, 10 fingerprints? How many make a relevant and actually authenticate you as a person? So there are those kinds of debates that, who would guess 10 years ago that we were going to be debating how many fingerprints qualifies me as an individual? It's these kinds of weird questions that arise as you start to deal with those kinds of issues.
Right. Well, and I would add that biometrics by themselves are not a perfect technology. So usually when you're implementing and you want to develop a real uniqueness around either a fingerprint characteristic or a face or an iris, usually the consensus is more is better. So to generate that uniqueness digitally, if you will, it actually takes a greater sampling, which is why some of these programs have moved to sampling more biometrics. And it's not, back to Kathy's point of risk basis, it's not a perfect technology. There are thresholds involved, and uniqueness can sometimes be compromised by that. So you really have to be careful in how you implement it. The technology's come a long way in the past few years, but it's still not a perfect.
I'll go back to Kathy's point too, and yours as well. This isn't just it's not just any one thing. One of the real powerful things about what we're looking at, and I think it protects privacy as well, is it's not any one piece. It's fingerprint plus a PIN, plus a card, so you have multiple layers. And that helps build in not only the defense, but also the protection for you as an individual that somebody isn't going to just get this data. And I mean, I think it's important, we had the VA situation last year where all sorts of data was lost. People take that very personally, and it touches individuals right at their core when they think, okay, all of a sudden my social security number is flying around the internet. 26 million numbers are, that really freaks them out. And so this is a real personal information that people really care about, and it needs to be treated very, very gingerly, I think.
Right, which, to your point, requires serious technology. It's multi-layered, so you've got a real integration issue that comes on as well. Recently, on Tech Talk, we had the opportunity to chat with with House Homeland Security Chairman Benny Thompson. He touched on this issue about biometrics and the use of passports and the need for technology to be part of the solution. Let's watch that and respond.
We can't just depend on a passport any longer. We know that passports, from a biographical standpoint, is one method, but really it's biometric. And we either have to do a fingerprint or iris scan, so that we've seen that is the only real way to go. We're trying to get that with U.S. Visit program. We're trying to get it in some of our other programs, but that's technology.
So we still need, the point he was making, some technology to catch up in regards to the biometrics. Is that what you see from your standpoint, a bearing point?
Yes, a number of these programs are really trying to implement those 3 core components. Something you have, which is that card or credential or passport. Something you know, which could be a personal identifier number or something like that. And something you are. And the something you are technology tends to be best implemented with biometric use. What we like about the more advanced credentials is that they can have that information stored on the credentials. So you're really comparing your live scan against what's stored on that credential, and it's all under your control, and it takes place essentially in an offline type of way. So that really helps maximize the privacy and leverage the use of these advanced credentials.
So you're making this play out. How is it going?
Well, I would say from the passport perspective, we're doing exactly what Chairman Thompson wants to see happen, and that is incorporating biometrics, and it's a matter of actually the digital photograph. Facial recognition and using facial biometrics has come a long way. It's not, again, 100%, as we've said and noted some of the weaknesses of biometrics in general, but it has progressed. And having a digital photograph standard that is international, that is applied to e-passports as they're being produced, and they've been out for well over a year with the visa waiver program countries and with the U.S. issuing those as well. And so we do see improvements there in our ability to again tie some of the things that Gordon was pointing to together and to use those in the travel context.
You must have to keep a scorecard of these different programs and how they relate.
They're always cautious where they use the term
Western
scorecard in federal agencies.
Good point. Yeah,
just
red,
another
green, or
scorecard is not.
Yes.
But a number of programs, I guess the Western Hemisphere travel is kind of at the top of your agenda right now. Is that right?
That is correct. That's definitely at the top of my agenda, but as you know, the office that I direct was created in particular to look at all of these programs across the board and start making sense of them from a customer service standpoint. How do we communicate transparently to those that are affected by these programs what the purpose is? How do we line things up so that when they have multiple requirements levied on them, like transportation workers, particularly as an example of hazardous materials truck drivers, and if they deliver to a port or if they cross the border with hazmat, there are multiple programs that touch those individuals, and we have to make sure we make it as easy as possible for them to comply with what's required. But it's also an investment standpoint of how do we explain to the taxpayers how we're using their dollars most efficiently as we invest.
Since a number of our viewers work for the federal government, talk for just a moment, if you could, please, about how this works with the new cards that are coming for federal workers.
Well, the Homeland Security Presidential Directive 12 was put in place to direct all the federal agencies to have one system for identifying and credentialing and using access control systems around this credential for federal employees and federal contractors. And it's really an end-to-end business process that was required to implement, but it has a heavy technology component to it. And what DHS, at least in particular, is doing to implement that is it involves a whole number of offices trying to get us to the best place possible to be able to use that card effectively. But it will impact access control and logical and physical, so getting onto your computers and logging on, and physical access, knowing who's in the building in the case of an incident in the National Capital Region. Those things are going to be really useful into the future, and that's the application that those credentials could be used for.
So not just the borders, but access to the federal workplace.
I think the federal government as a model for the rest of the country is interesting, and in many ways it's easier because you look at the Defense Department for years has been rolling out the Common Access Card, CAC, and they've done a really good job. There are 4 million CAC out there. And they've done a really good job of implementing this, and it was I remember the party that people had when the Pentagon itself, everybody else was using the Common Access Card except the Pentagon itself. And it's like, what's going on here? Yeah. But I think you see some of the issues that you're going to see on a national basis. As they're rolling out HSP 12, a lot of the feds are all of a sudden saying, hold on, I'm giving up information that I consider private. Exactly. Yep. And so you're seeing some feds push back on that, and all of a sudden the realization. So I think it may serve as the federal government, because it is sort of in a way a campus, you're seeing some of the issues that you would face on a larger scale with some of these issues as they roll out on a national basis.
Right. We'll see that play out as a place where we can maybe learn from what's going on in the federal space.
There are a lot of lessons to learn.
Very often we talk about technology and we talk about what we can learn from the commercial space. Are there some things we can learn from the commercial space coming into this?
In some ways I think yes, in some ways no. I think the commercial space has really led and spent a lot of time on what I call back-end identity issuance and authentication. When we log onto a website today, our identity is being authenticated more or less by information we previously provided. So that rapid ability to digitally process an identity, I think, is something that really comes directly from the commercial sector. But on the other side, I think the U.S. government, the federal government, has really led the way in some areas to the point where the international community is watching us pretty closely. To Kathy's point, we defined an end-to-end standard by which an identity is proofed and processed and credentialed, essentially. And I don't think anyone ever took on that expanse of putting that into a standard. So what we've really done is set a real common threshold by which background checks are set, conducted, and identity is proved and credentialing takes place. So with that strong foundation, that really is going to enable the digital economy that the government wants to.
Go ahead, Chris.
There are a couple points that I think we shouldn't get away from this conversation. One is, I think a lot of these privacy issues, I think they're going to be addressed. This is one of these, identifying identity is so important, and everyone brings up the New Yorker cartoon, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. When this gets all figured out, and we've been working on it for a number of years now, I think it's going to be one of those enabling technologies that just helps agencies, organizations, everybody do things that we just never even envisioned that we could even do before. So I think this identity thing, while it's taken a while, it's probably going to take a while longer. I think it's going to be a very powerful technology as the internet and as online services and all this stuff evolves. And I think we're going to see things that come out of this that we didn't even imagine before.
It has certainly been the short history of information technology that there are other benefits that you couldn't foresee. Will that be true of Real ID also? We've spent some time talking about identity. We have talked about Real ID, which has been a bit of a flashpoint.
Well, and that's one of the we always say, why is this so difficult? Well, particularly on a federal level, it's difficult because it's not just feds. If you're going to really look at identity management, it's federal, state, and local. And then you layer on the international aspects, and you're just opening Pandora's box. So there are real issues that this isn't as easy as everyone just do it. Real ID is a perfect example. As sort of states, it dawned upon states that what they were going to have to do. Well, you saw people freaking out all over the place, and in fact, certain states, show me the money. Certain states even saying, no, time out, go back, do over. And so it'll be interesting to see as that works out legislatively. Congress is getting a lot of pressure. They have the pressure that they want to secure the homeland, but they also have their lawmakers and their citizens at home saying, we don't have the money to do this.
Now I want to come back to Congress in a minute. Go ahead, Kathy.
I was going to say, at the same time, with respect to Real ID, you have the recognition of the Department of Motor Vehicles across the country and the states really since 9/11 that driver's licenses are the predominant identity credential. And for that reason alone, and given the rise of identity theft in our country as a very real problem, they recognize the need to enhance how they issue. And while Real ID...
September 11th, who would guess that the DMV would be our main line of identification, and it really is.
And some people resist that. I'm constantly amazed. You have to remind people about the use of false driver's licenses around 9/11.
Well, I just went in and got my new driver's license, and I had to come in with my passport, and I had to get my birth certificate and all these things. Pain in the neck. But sort of, you have to constantly remind people that there is a reason why we're doing this, that it's scary when I went back and reread the 9/11 Commission report, and these guys were mostly in here, and they had legal documents. And so we do need to address that process in some form or fashion.
Absolutely connects back to...
I think what underlines every one of these identity programs is trust, and the matter of can another party trust what someone has issued to that individual as a valid document. And I think what we're going to see is a paradigm shift in having some interoperable media on a driver's license, for example, that can be read and verified, as well as no longer really relying on the physical appearance of a credential for letting someone go someplace.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think there's trust, but I think there's a serious training component. There's a whole culture when it comes, at least thinking of the federal campus for a moment, a culture about what it is to check somebody into the building and so forth that really has to change, so that you're not You don't have biometrics on a card and then just wave it at the guy. And
on the technology side, we always say it really isn't the technology, it's all the other things. And I think that's sort of what's come through in this conversation, is that it's all those other things that, I'd never disagree with Congressman Thompson, but in a way, it's not really the technology that is the hindrance here. It's all these other issues. It's when you do come into or out of a federal building, hold on, I've always done it this way, why does it need to change? And I think to some degree, we haven't done a very good job of explaining why these changes need to take place. And you have to constantly remind people, and particularly as 9/11 starts to a little bit fade into our memory,
Yes, yeah.
It's important to remember what happened then and why we're doing some of these things.
We are so close to the national debates here, I think we sometimes forget that you have to explain to...
Out in the great heartland,
Right.
it's not, didn't touch, not that it didn't touch them, but
Right.
it's not, they aren't dealing with it on a day in,
basis, right. The way we do. And one of the reasons we do that, of course, and we can't have any conversation in Washington without talking about Congress. Chris, let me ask you, as you report on this whole scene, what kinds of things do we need Congress to do right now to advance this identity management effort?
There's certainly a lot of money that needs to, we've seen a lot of the like Real ID. We saw the amendments get passed and things, frankly, fairly quickly, and I think some of that debate actually hardens out. They could have foreseen some of the problems that were going to come if they had spent more than a half an hour discussing the bill.
Sure.
So, those kinds of things, actually fleshing out the ideas, but also if this is important, I always say money is a real good way of assessing what you consider a priority. And if it's really important, let's put money behind it and spend money. And maybe it means you need to make choices in other places. But I think this is a big issue that we have to deal with.
Or maybe it means you have to make sure you're talking to the localities and the governors. I know you just did that here very recently, Kathy. Anything that you took away from that meeting that you think that our Congress needs to know or be aware of?
Well, I think all of these issues are partnerships. Going back to driver's licenses, we touched on a little earlier, but the state and local governments do have a responsibility here. And it isn't just about federal money. It's about matching that at the state and local level and matching that commitment and understanding, again, why it is that we're doing the things that we're doing. And I think I have found that. So this is not an accusation in any way. I think they are convinced, they are committed to these improvements and recognize the importance of it. And I think there is certainly a role for Congress to continue to watch that. And I'll leave the funding discussion to Chris and others.
Most of these programs are funded by the fees charged for the service, although you could argue in several of these programs the funds collected don't always make their way back to the program. But I would say that if you had more startup money, because as an industry member, we're being asked more and more to make that investment on some of these programs, and we'd like some subsidization.
And do it under a fixed price.
And do it on a fixed price under a very aggressive timeline. So, the biggest help there is maybe some startup funding to get these infrastructures in place, because there is a significant upfront investment.
I think the state and local aspect is particularly interesting because, states for a long time have felt they always end up at the short end of the mandates. There are all sorts of mandates that come down from Washington, and there's never any recognition about the expense and the costs that go along with that. And I think that's what you're seeing a little bit, is states just saying, okay, we're done. Go do it. If this is important, go do it yourself. And so there needs to be sort of a new formation, a new dialogue between federal, state, and local, involving them all. So it's no longer, people pointing fingers, which it tends to happen. You get a state, local, and federal person, and everyone's saying, well, it's not my fault. They didn't do their jobs.
Yeah.
And we need to get beyond that at some point.
Right. Really move the debate forward on this, because it is critical to security, which is why we have the Department of Homeland Security here. One of the security concerns I think people have, and perhaps one of the fears tying to privacy, is what I think is a misconception. Gordon, I'll let you answer that there's going to be this big database with all this information in it about, with my iris scans, my fingerprints, my date of birth, my favorite TV show, and everything else you want to think of. And that scares me, because if anybody breaks into that one thing, they're going to know all about me. How would you answer somebody, or maybe a congressman who has that fear?
I'd say that's not the case. I think you heard us mention several programs. Each one of these programs has one or more databases involved. I think the key is really getting towards interoperability of credentials. There shouldn't be a reason that one application can't use a driver's license issued by a state.
So give me an example of some of the different databases that a single solution might pull from, for instance?
So the visit program might be a solution. DHS operates a system called IDENT, focused on verifying foreign national identity. There are many systems out there. The Transportation Worker Program will have a database that it uses to issue credentials. But the key is really that those systems only obtain and retain the minimum amount of data needed to do the job of that system. What we see is what primarily drives data retention is needs to conduct background checks over time to keep people current, and also to be able to reissue a credential should the person lose it or it's stolen or something like that. That's why the passport system keeps a database for the citizens issued passports. So it's a matter of having these different systems, having them very secure, very protected, continually assessed and evaluated for that security and managed towards that, but also the interoperability piece of having the ability to cross-verify credentials and trust them. So.
And Kathy, you're living with that every day. Is it working? Are we able to pull from the different databases into a single solution and then interoperate?
We're working in that direction, certainly. I wouldn't say we have 100% attained it, but at the same time, we are setting up the verification systems, and Real ID, for example, is an attempt to get to that point.
Real ID, by the way, in layman's terms, would be?
Improving driver's licenses based on a federal standard, but at the same time recognizing that the states will have a lot of flexibility in how they do that given their business processes and their needs. And we have taken steps forward to give them a little more detail through our rulemaking, at least the notice level, and then we're moving to a final rule to help them understand what it is that they're going to be required to do. But part of that does get to verifying the breeder documents that are presented to them to establish identity. And that's something that we'll continue to work on, but we are not
breeder documents, another kind of term of art in the,
yes, that's true.
Trade.
It's my favorite term,
yes.
breeder document.
Yeah.
It's all those documents that, essentially prove that the document you're getting is, it's this lowest common, the thing about ID management is it's the lowest common denominator. Whatever is the weakest link is whatever. So if that's the driver's license, if that's the birth certificate, if that's the passport, whatever is the weakest link, and whatever is the weakest link giving that, so if there's one state that happens to be particularly easy to get a driver's license in, you'll find bad people using that state.
The weakest link is going to attract the...
And the bad people are smart, and they figure that out. And they somehow, the federal agencies may not always network amongst themselves. The bad guys somehow always do, and they always know where to go and what to, how to get through, or at least the ones we hear about. So it's, it's important. I think the concept behind the Real ID is an important one. It is a standard. The driver's license is the standard that everybody uses. Right. For all intents and purposes. And there should be some kind of backing so it's not the weakest link anymore. And it's a question of how we all know where we want to get, how do we get there?
And I think as we modernize and implement a lot of these newer systems, they're being implemented with very strong checks and balances in the system and very strong roles that have to perform certain functions with strong audits. So I think we're trying to address some of the weaknesses seen in previous programs. And there's other infrastructures being put in place, like, for example, the federal bridge, where they're trying to really put in those infrastructures to cross-authenticate various agents and even commercial entities. And there are some programs.
The federal bridge really being a fiber connection so that people can
essentially almost a central clearinghouse, if you will, for identity and authentication to different assurance levels with a model in place. And I think a similar program exists in the states that they've been using for a few years and piloting, where they can cross-check driver's license and verify the validity of the driver's license.
And I think the bridge is actually an important sort of test case because the bridge itself doesn't hold this data.
Right. Correct.
Right. And so it becomes a place where, hold on, it's that weakest link, and the bridge becomes the place where everyone can sort of check their weakest links.
Correct.
And you have different levels. So if I think that's an important concept that Kathy mentioned. You need different levels for different things. For just getting on an airplane, you don't need top secret level for that. But there are various levels, and now all that is the assessment of risk. How much risk do we actually put in various activities?
Kind of the driving question for so many of these programs, I guess, really.
Absolutely.
How to assess that risk.
Absolutely.
Exit question. I want to give each of you an opportunity to tell us what you think the next big challenge is that we're going to look for in this general topic of ID management. And along the way, you can certainly tell us, too, if you think we're better off today than after 6 years after the infamous date of 9/11. I'm going to start over here with you, Gordon. What's the next big challenge?
I think the big challenge is really getting a number of these programs underway and getting the infrastructure in place to use the credential. There's always that challenge of having both the infrastructure and then the bow wave of people possessing the credentials to get them used. So that's what we're very focused on now. And then to your question, are we better off? I think we are, just by the fact that we brought attention to the issues and really some of the core sources of where the terrorists got their valid identity documents in 9/11. We've attacked some of those core issues of verifying identity, having a long history of identity-related transactions and those types of things. So I think we are better off, and we're continuing to work away at increasing overall security when it comes to personnel.
Chris, let's go to you.
You know, one of the great things about working in this particular industry, not that I work in it, but as these guys, is there's no endless, you never run out of challenges. There's always a new challenge, and there's plenty of them. I think one of the big issues is privacy. One of the big issues is this working not only with federal, state, and local, but among feds. Feds have difficult time working amongst one another. I think probably the biggest challenge is to constantly remind people why we're doing this. That there is, yes, it's not just because of September 11th, but there are a whole host of other reasons. We were talking about identity management before September 11th, and that's because I really do believe that this can really lay groundwork that can help us do so many other things. It's a powerful, powerful tool if we get it all worked out right. And it's that sort of working it all out right. It's taken time, and I think it's important to take time to do it in the right way.
Incredibly complex and large undertaking.
We don't want to do it quickly because we end up with things like Real ID where we rush through and then end up not dealing with the real issues that we have to, that are out there. September 11th, I absolutely think, I totally agree with Gordon that we've come a long way just by addressing the issue. It's now something that is at least a subject for debate on a national scale. It's not just tech geeks that are talking about it, and it's real. And there is a real case example of where it went wrong, and we need to fix it. So I think it's absolutely come a long way, and the fact that it's getting national attention is a major, major step forward.
And Kathy, we'll finish with you. Let me say thank you for your public service, by the way. I appreciate what you do for the country, and I presume you think we're better off. I'm really interested in what you see as the next big challenge in your world.
Absolutely. Well, I definitely do think we're better off, of course, for all of the reasons that people have seen, all the programs that we put in place and layers we put in place in the security world, not just in identity management, but also clearly in that area. In terms of challenges forward, we really do have what Gordon mentioned earlier is the trust issue. We're starting to put these programs in place. We're starting to roll them out, like the TWIC program with transportation workers in ports, and like driver's license enhancements. And the issues, though, are, and HSPD 12 actually is probably a great example of that. How do we put those programs in place at departments or in particular states, and then get to a point where those documents, once issued by one agency, are recognized by the other agency as being issued on par and to the same standards?
When you unroll those, making sure people understand the value that they're getting out of that. If we roll the programs out, I dare say, and don't explain what the value was to the taxpayer or to the state or locality, people are going to be left wondering, why or what was the payoff.
Yeah, there's a big buy-in issue here too. Yes. And in terms of, again, and we're doing a lot of that with outreach to those that will be using it, and building those bridges to, for example, first responders, and talking about what credentialing can do for them in terms of tying into that federal bridge and looking at incident management and credentialing. So there are a lot of different facets to it as we move forward.
Great. Well, let me thank you all for joining us on this conversation about identity management here on Tech Talk, and we'll invite all of you to join us next time for Tech Talk. Thank you.